live. Hi there and welcome to the Byline Times podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg, and the Byline Times investigations editor, Nafeez Ahmed. Nafeez has been tracing the plan to bring about regime change in Iran, a plan orchestrated, according to Nafeez's research, by US neoconservatives dating back 30 years. It's a fascinating story, which you can read at bylinetimes.com, but we're going to try and unpack it a little bit for you. And if you're watching this live on Substack, we'll take one or two of your questions as well. So, Nafeez, there may be some younger listeners, younger viewers watching this who don't really know who the neocons were, the neoconservatives. So just a little primer on the neocons of the mid-90s.
So in the mid-90s, there were a group of kind of hawkish policy wonks in the United States, also in Israel, Britain, other parts of Western Europe, who basically believed that the traditional kind of foreign policy structure wasn't working. They wanted kind of, what they would describe as robust preemptive intervention to solve the problems of the Middle East and, other parts of the world, Central Asia and elsewhere. There were also other ideological undercurrents. These guys were often influenced by kind of a clash of civilizations type theory of the world. They thought that this was inevitable. They kind of saw the world in these discrete camps. There was Western civilization, Chinese civilization, and a kind of Islamic civilization, and they saw these things as inevitably clashing. So for them, this was like getting ahead of the clash and preemptively asserting America's kind of primacy. There's a lot of different bits and pieces that came out around this movement, but kind of the thrust of it is that use force to reshape the world, basically. And some of them would say that we were just doing this for democracy. This is all about projecting the wonderful Western ideals and values around the world. And I think some of them really did believe that. And many others just saw it as a kind of manifest destiny of, we need to kind of project force to protect power and interests.
And we should be clear as well that this clean break strategy, which you argue lies at the heart of the current invasion of Iran and which dates back to 1996, doesn't just impact Iran. It was drafted for the incoming Israeli president Netanyahu and was a roadmap for the developments of the Middle East, much of which, it has to be said, has come to pass in the years since.
That's right. So the story kind of begins in 1996. Some of you guys might be aware of this document that was published. It was called A Clean Break. This was prepared for a Jerusalem-based think tank. I think it was called the Institute for Advanced Political Studies or something like that. Several American authors, people like Richard Pearl, who ended up being part of the Bush administration. He headed up the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and Advisory Board. So this little group of people drafted this blueprint, which was supposed to be for the same guy who's in charge of the show in Israel right now, Benjamin Netanyahu. Obviously, this is not the first time he's been prime minister. He was incoming prime minister at that time. So they prepared this blueprint for him. And this blueprint was quite a shocking kind of plan to advocating that Israel, backed by kind of unconditional force from the United States, should seek security by completely redrawing the map of the Middle East. The idea was to, this is years before the Iraq War, but Saddam Hussein's regime was already fingered as kind of a high priority for regime change, followed by, kind of a rolling series of actions, including Syria and Iran, as well as several other countries, including Lebanon. So much of what we see unfolding today can be traced back to the strategic kind of parameters that were set out in this document, which really was a roadmap for reshaping the entire region through force. Now, I think where the connecting point gets really interesting is the evidence that I uncovered which shows that the very same people who were involved in this neoconservative strategy, which is very much linked to supporting Israel, kind of an expansionist view of Israeli militarism, are now influencing the Trump administration 30 years on. And I think that's the thing that I found most shocking is that, and there was a connecting bridge here, which was an organization called the Project for a New American Century, which I wrote about many years ago, which was a kind of Bush era think tank, which took many of the ideas that were kind of formulated under the clean break kind of document, and then inserted them into much more directly into American foreign policy thinking. So Project for a New American Century was set up again in the 90s. They wrote to Bill Clinton when he was president, saying that you need to go and invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein. And in the year 2000, a year before 9/11, they produced this kind of their own blueprint for American foreign policy, which again is astonishing. Many of you might remember this document because at the time, kind of a few months after 9/11, it made big headlines when journalists were looking back at what was written in that document, and they were saying, everything the Bush administration is doing after 9/11 was written in this document. Well, the war in Iraq, it kind of expanding all over the place. And most disturbingly, in this document was this plan about essentially targeting 7 countries across the Middle East and Central Asia, including Somalia, Libya, but all, the countries that are currently being targeted as well. So that was the kind of connecting bridge, the PNAC, as it was called, the acronym. And the current entity which is channeling all of this into the Trump administration is a foreign policy coalition called the Vandenberg Coalition, which was set up a few years ago, and it run by a guy called Elliot Abrams, who was involved in various scandals in American foreign policy, which we don't need to go into these at length, but they were very well known. But the most critical thing was that this guy was deeply involved in this nexus, in the kind of PNAC nexus. He was a signatory to the original PNAC statement of principles. And now he's just before the current administration, in the first Trump administration, Elliot Abrams was Trump's special envoy on Iran and Venezuela. And so he is currently running this kind of policy shop, and several people on his advisory board have direct ties to the Trump administration. So that's kind of the connecting line that we have.
Okay, well, let's go back then to the original document prepared for the Institute of Advanced Strategic and Political Studies. And I think it's important to explore the people behind that. There were people like Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, David Vermser. Who were these people, and why do they now have a policy which is playing out 30 years later? What's the connection between these individuals and a policy document? Because, of course, all sorts of think tanks publish policy documents, and action now by the US state.
So these guys were American neoconservatives, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, David Wormser. So they were based in the United States. They were working with Republicans, and many of them had ended up having senior positions inside the Bush administration after having written this document. So within the Bush administration, George W. Bush's administration, they essentially began implementing these policies. So, Douglas Feith, who is an author of this clean break, Israeli blueprint, he served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Bush administration. This same guy was also found to have produced false intelligence assessments on an alleged Iraq Al-Qaeda relationship. Between there was this whole idea that Saddam was harboring Osama bin Laden and so on and so forth. He was the main guy driving this. And it was completely false. There was a investigation by the Pentagon's Inspector General, which just debunked all of this and said there was no basis to these allegations. Another guy, David Wormser, co-author of the Clean Break report, he became Middle East advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. So that's, we can go through the list, but all of these guys had these influences. Now, many of these same people who were involved in the Project for a New American Century now have roles in the Vandenberg coalition. One of the most significant, for instance, is this guy, is David Feith. Now, David Feith is Douglas Feith's son. He served in the first Trump administration in a senior position. He's now serving on Trump's National Security Council as a senior advisor on national security and technology issues. So you have this direct line, that the father came up with these ideas and the son is now executing. And, he sits on he's an advisory board member on the Vandenberg coalition as well. So are other people who were involved in this. Louis Libby, who was one of the founding signatories of the Project for a New American Century, which is, as I mentioned, was channeling the clean break framework into an American foreign policy architecture. He's also involved. He's on the Vandenberg coalition, which is currently directly involved in advising the Trump administration. And several of the things that they have been saying the Trump administration should do in the Middle East. No sooner that Trump came into power earlier this year, they had published a whole document on what should, saying that Trump should exert maximum pressure on Iran and several other things. All of those things that the Vandenberg coalition said should be done, the Trump administration subsequently did. Louis Libby is he's on the board of the Vandenberg's advisory council. He's also a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is another think tank, which is also part of this coalition. There's also a cabinet member, the United States trade representative, Trump's trade representative, Jameson Greer, he's kind of seen as the kind of architect of Trump's tariff policy, his whole global tariff regime, which includes the subset of that, economic tariffs targeted at Iran as part of this maximum pressure strategy. In January, as part of that tariff kind of tariff set, a subset of that was to target tariffs on any country that was going to have any sort of economic relationship with Iran. So Jameson Greer was also behind that. He's also a member of the Vandenberg coalition. And so there's a whole bunch of these people who are holding these kind of different roles, but all of them having this input into the Trump administration's thinking around national security and the Middle East. And that's what's really disturbing, because what you then have is this direct pipeline from the very people who came up with this clean break strategy 30 years ago into essentially redrawing the map of the Middle East, who are now sitting in this very, very influential lobby group, which has, we now know, directly influenced what the Trump administration is thinking and doing in the Middle East.
And you've touched on this a little bit in the introduction, Nafeez, but what justification do they use for redrawing the map of the Middle East? In what sense is that deemed to be in the best interests of the United States? And why is the United States seeking to do this, albeit perhaps in its own self-interest, but also in the interests of Israel? Why would it do that?
So difficult to say, but what we do know is that this structure began to some extent 30 years ago, where you had a movement. This was a kind of an intellectual policy movement at the heart of the foreign policy establishment, and these people for a long time were seen as pariahs. New conservatives were not part of the mainstream, but in the 1990s that started to change. And I think after 9/11, this catastrophic attack on the United States, there was an appetite now to say, well, actually, these ideas that were surfacing or going around at the time should be taken up. We need to have a more aggressive posture. But I think underlying all of this, you see that there was this general idea that was uniting policymakers in Israel and these kind of hawkish policymakers in Israel and hawkish policymakers in the United States around this idea that the US and Israel should essentially use force to create a new architecture of power. They used a term like global preeminence, which was a term that was often used even in Pentagon planning guidance. So there was this idea that of maintaining the structure of world order in which American power was preeminent. So there was this underlying, and this goes back through, there's lots of international relations theory and all this stuff around this, but it really comes back to this basic idea of the Americans playing this role as kind of like the global police state. They were the ones who maintained the stability of the international order. It was a slightly self-serving, so it's interesting to look at it because on the one hand, you've got kind of Machiavellian kind of thinking, which is definitely there, where you've got people who are thinking, well, actually, this is an opportunity for us to pursue our interests, to maximize control of resources, of labor, of strategic countries that are useful for the American economy. So for them, there was a direct kind of interest for American industry and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there was also a kind of a self-soothing and self-serving ideology here, which is that, oh, well, we're doing this wonderful service to the world by ensuring, this architecture of stability requires American preeminence. You need to have the hegemon, this overwhelming power to use force to keep order for everybody else to be safe. And so this idea, these two things kind of were constantly in competing with each other. And I think, the events of 9/11, various terrorist attacks, the rise of various kind of threats to this order were seen as kind of, well, this is a reason to keep this system going. But I think what's ironic is in the Project for a New American Century document, there is a reference there to they spoke about the idea of needing to maintain a permanent force presence in the Middle East in order to safeguard access to oil and gas supplies. So there was fundamentally underlying this was a recognition that in order to lubricate this system, this economic system as well, this system of continuous growth and stability in the American economic and financial system and the global economic and financial system, you needed to maintain access to these highly centralized oil and gas reserves, which happen to be in these regions in the Middle East. And they also recognized that this would not be a very palatable idea for the general public. Most people would not necessarily agree with the idea that the Americans should maintain this heightened force presence in a country like Iraq. Why would we need that? So they said, well, the only way that we might be able to sustain and justify such a thing, and I'm paraphrasing now, was imagine if there was a kind of a Pearl Harbor type attack in the United States. That might be the kind of thing that would convince people of the need to have this kind of a thing, which is, when obviously this 9/11 happened, something like a year later, and then people were looking back at this, we were all shocked because it was like a year before the events of 9/11, you got people talking about the idea of a catastrophic attack on the United States being a kind of a justifying factor. Now, of course, that kind of fueled all sorts of conspiracy theories and everything else. But I think what it really demonstrates is that there wasn't really a brilliant justification for all of this. And policymakers actually realized that in order for you to justify this, you need to have the specter of an unprecedented threat. So how does that kind of help us kind of conceive and understand what's going on today? What's clear is that if we're looking at the kind of the things that have been focused on now, we've got multiple contradictory narratives. One of them is that, we wanted regime change to Prime Minister Netanyahu was talking about the need to have democracy in Iran, and they're fighting to have democracy for the Iranian people. We've seen some of that language in the United States, but then we also heard that this is about eliminating the nuclear threat to America and Israel. And then we've also heard that this is about eliminating the ballistic missile threat. And then we've also heard that this is about eliminating the fact that Iran is the number one terrorist threat to the world. So we've got all of these different things. And at different times, they're saying, it's this, it's that. It's about the Iranian women and the Iranian people. When we start to pick apart these things bit by bit, well, actually, let's look deeply at each of these things. It starts to become very questionable. Let's just look at the nuclear thing, for instance. Last year, we had this redux around nuclear. And, we already had a 12-day war with Israel and the United States striking Iran's nuclear capability, after which Trump told the world, we have obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities. So why are we having a war a year on to obliterate Iran's nuclear capabilities? It's like deja vu. Just the other day, Trump was standing on the podium in the White House saying that Iran was weeks away from having a bomb. Well, let's go back last year. I did another story on this for Byline Times about the role of Palantir's AI, a platform called Mosaic, which also was actually repurposed from an older Israeli Defense Force AI system that has been used by the International Atomic Energy Agency as part of its data analytics and surveillance program of Iran's nuclear capabilities. Now, critics have noticed earlier on that this is a predictive modeling software that looks at some of the, absorbs all of this hundreds of millions of data points from satellite imagery and stuff on the ground and so on and so forth, and then does predictive modeling. And they've warned that it's kind of like a minority report for uranium. If people remember the Tom Cruise film Minority Report, which is all about a dystopian future where the police are, pre-crime prediction. You're able to predict criminals using data and then kind of just going and putting people in jail based on what you think is going to happen. So that's what that criticism was about. This idea, is there a danger that actually there wasn't really firm intelligence, but instead there was an AI modeling platform that said that, Iran was on the brink of uranium in weeks.
And just to be clear and go back to your 9/11 reference there, you're not suggesting that you support any of the conspiracy theories around 9/11, just that a year before, the architects of this plan identified that it would take a catastrophic event to persuade the American people that there needed to be this intervention in the Middle East, and 9/11 gave them that. And so the Iraq war, which followed, if I'm following your analysis correctly, was an opportunist moment. It gave President Bush the opportunity to say, well, look, there is this catastrophic threat. There has been this catastrophic incident that has happened. We need now to react to this threat, which led to the invasion of Iraq and regime change in Iraq. And it's the same kind of thinking, albeit without the same kind of catastrophic trigger that lies behind the invasion of Iraq now, the desire for regime change and a more permanent remodeling of the Middle East's geopolitics.
That's right. I think what became clear after 9/11 is that the kind of the war plan that was being executed on the pretext of responding to the 9/11 attacks had already existed before 9/11. I mean, I did a lot of work on this, and I don't support conspiracy theories around 9/11, but I do support investigation of the 9/11 official narrative, which has basically kind of exculpated a lot of these, kind of deep-seated questions, anomalies around the failures in the national security system. For instance, relationships with Islamist militant groups during the Cold War and after the post-Cold War period, relationships with regimes like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, who are actually supporting many of these terrorist organizations, and intelligence coming in about there's lots of very legitimate questions to ask about 9/11 and about national security failures and really deep-seated systemic challenges without falling into kind of completely kind of baseless conspiracy theories. But I think the learning from this is that we've already seen that there was an architecture of militarism that been developing for years. And then 9/11 happened and it was exploited. And I think what the PNAC document showed was that actually many of these people quite deliberately exploited that threat, because they'd already been thinking about this. They'd already been thinking about how do we justify these plans. And in a way, quite tragically, 9/11 was almost like a gift to some of these people. And that's what I find so deeply alarming, is that when you're looking at that 30-year history, that same structure, that same mindset still exists now. So in far from a kind of a position of trying to actually solve these challenges in a way that is meaningful, what we have instead is this lobbying groups that for years have been wanting to find a way and a reason to completely reshape the Middle East. And what we can see is that these rationales for reshaping the Middle East didn't have anything to do fundamentally with Western national security. They were driven by ideologues who had a view of what they thought force projections should achieve. Go in and kind of, rightly or wrongly, inflict democracy by force on 7 countries around the world to reshape the order. I think what we now know, 20 years on, 20 years of having these forever wars, we've seen that this doesn't work. When we invaded Afghanistan, we had tremendous air power. We had troops on the ground, multiple allied forces, fought for 20 years. Where are we now? We now have an even more strengthened Taliban, which is now literally fighting an open war with its neighbor Pakistan. This is happening on the border of Iran. So there's already a war happening right on Iran's border. What do we think is going to happen? The idea that bombing Iran, whether you bomb Iran from the air or people are talking about ground invasion or not, they're now talking about, we've now had leaks from the CIA showing that they're planning to arm, and they've already been having talks with giving weapons to armed groups, Kurdish groups in Iraqi Kurdistan. And these are disparate groups. Some of them are people who've said that we should have a federalized secular Iran with some sort of autonomy for Kurds in Iran. Others are saying that there should be an actual kind of separatist autonomous state. Others are even more separatist. They don't all agree. This is a nightmare. And the thing is that we've seen this already. We've seen what happened in Syria, where you have different factions, different views, with different ideas about the future of the country. You throw arms in there, you throw volatility, you throw all of this in, it leads to absolute chaos and collapse. So the real scenario here is not a regime change. It is a prolonged civil war, and the Islamic Republican Guard are more than likely to go underground, become more radicalized and hardline, and continue to fight. So, while this civil war dimension kind of becomes a magnet for extremist radicalization in the region.
And the Vandenberg coalition, the group which has carried forth this legacy, this ideological legacy, they published a document, a framework called Deals of the Century, Solving the Middle East, upon Trump's arrival back in the White House for his second term, didn't it? And they proposed, for example, the termination of funding to UNRWA, the UN agency responsible for helping Palestinian refugees and so on. So it's clear, which has come under massive pressure from Trump, who has accused it of allying with Hamas and being a terrorist organization and so on. So you can see these think tank documents, these think tank policies working out in real time in US foreign policy and clearly, most obviously, in Iran. You touched there on a phrase, Nafeez, forever wars, which of course Trump promised in the run-up to his second election to end. There would be no more forever wars under Trump. But first with Venezuela, albeit that was in inverted commas, cleanly executed removal of the head of state there, Nicolas Maduro, now in Iran, which, like you, I suspect, may not be such a clean break. We do seem to have a new era of American colonialism, for want of a better word. And what's interesting for me is that the polling shows that that is not popular with the American people. And we mentioned that after the catastrophe of 9/11, there may well have been an understanding amongst the US population that, or a belief that what was being enacted in Iraq was somehow justified. The same with what was being enacted in Afghanistan. There seems to be much less support and sympathy for the action in Iran now taken by Trump.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the polls are pretty much rock bottom on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of support for this action. And I think that's only going to get worse with time, because it's absolutely clear that there's no, so what's interesting here is that from the outside, it looks like there's no clear strategic goal, and I think to some extent, it is clear that in terms of what your military objectives are, there are no clear military strategic objectives here. But I think the danger is that the fact that there are no clear military strategic objectives is precisely part of the point. Because if you have an open-ended conflict, and I think this is what we need to then ask ourselves, is that have they kind of just by sheer incompetence decided not to have objectives that are clear, that they can articulate clearly and actually measure the success of the campaign by? Or is that by design? I do think there is a lot of incompetence in this administration in many ways, but I think there is a question as to whether this is very much about some of the ideas that we see written in the clean break strategy, which are now getting discussed, in major Israeli newspapers like Yediot Ahronot, the kind of biggest selling newspaper in Israel, openly talking about the idea of using this moment to fundamentally redraw the map of the Middle East. And I think that's what's at play here, is this idea, fundamentally, that it doesn't matter whether we get regime change or not. Force should be used. If you're reading the clean break strategy, force should be used fundamentally to completely debilitate and destroy Iranian power. That is a very different equation, but you can begin to get a glimpse of that when you listen to what Pete Hegseth is saying at the podium repeatedly. Actually listen to what he's saying. Don't just assume it's there for a joke. It's not just a joke. These aren't just memes, even though they are memes. They're fighting a war by meme. But he's saying that this is about raining destruction down on Iran. Hitting them again and again when they're down, unable to offer a clear sense of when does this end, why is this happening, where does it really go, and kind of glorifying in this moment of this exertion of power. I think we should take that very seriously. This is very much about inflicting maximum damage and destruction without concern for the consequences. Are they aware then that this is going to lead to fundamental destabilization? We've just heard that there's just been plans that have been described in Congress, plans to deploy the National Guard to 50 states in the United States, 23,000 troops they wanted to, talking about deploying. Questions were asked of, I think, one of the sort of junior defense officials, and he just said, we'll get back to you on that. We're not going to elaborate right now, or something to that effect. What is going on? What are they thinking? Why are they planning for this kind of sort of contingency? I am concerned that there has been thinking about the reality that when you inflict this kind of devastation, and this has been extensively wargamed. This has been wargamed over decades. In no scenario is there a meaningful winner. Now, in every scenario you look at, ultimately, I think in these scenarios, what you come out with is America or Israel kind of win in the sense that, Iran is kind of left in a totally kind of horrific state of destruction and who's the last man standing kind of thing. But there's no real winner in most of these scenarios, because what ends up happening is Iran is incentivized to lash out as they have been doing, but to escalate that lashing out. We've just had the oil refinery in Bahrain targeted. We're going to see more of that. We're going to see oil and gas facilities across the region targeted. We're going to see chaos. And this is going to be we've already had the Strait of Hormuz shut down, where 1/5 of the world's oil supplies are traveling through. That's going to get worse. So the idea that the Trump administration is just doing this with no thinking and no thought as to that scenario is not believable. They know that there is going to be a catastrophic impact on the global economy and financial system. There's going to be huge oil price spikes. Things are going to grind to a halt. There is going to be chaos in the homeland at some point when people wake up and they say, this is unconscionable. This is impossible to deal with. And so my concern is, with the convergence of these things, I think that's, and then so you've got this convergence of domestic unrest, domestic instability, with concern, inside the America, concerns about the Trump administration's concern to kind of stay in power through the midterms and maximize their control. At the same time, you've got these Epstein files, which are now being released, and as we speak, files literally being published talking about the crimes of the president of the United States against minors, children. It's a combustible situation, which is very, very difficult to predict. But I think in that scenario, when you've got a group of criminals in the White House who are desperate to stay in power, it's very difficult to kind of just put this down to just pure, we don't know what's going on, there's no objective. I think they're exploiting this instability to centralize and militarize the homeland.
They are the masters of the chaos which they themselves have created. And just as an end thought, Nafeez, the thousands of people who took to the streets of Iran in an attempt to overthrow what I would regard as a barbarous regime, the people who sacrificed their lives in pursuit of freedom and democracy, ideals which, in theory at least, the United States has stood for many years, even if not in practice. Those thousands of people and their families, their colleagues, their friends, who might also then wish to live in a free and secular democracy, for all that has been said about those people and the support and the help that is coming supposedly for those people from the United States, they are way, way, way down in the pecking order of interests of the United States.
I think that's totally valid point. And I think that's what's kind of been lost in a lot of this conversation. It's really important to bring back is that in what way does this really serve the idea of democracy in Iran? There's no way. It's absolutely not the case. I mean, this is there was no, I don't think there is any serious analyst, and certainly not military and strategic analysts who've looked at this scenario and said there was a real prospect of getting rid of the regime and allowing democracy to somehow emerge and blossom and flourish. It's completely preposterous. You cannot bomb democracy into existence. And that, again, the whole approach, again, just surfaces this reality that this is not about the Iranian people. It's not about Iranian democracy. And I think that's the reality is that the people who have come out on the streets in Iran and risked their lives and ended up getting shot in the streets, family members killed and so on and so forth. They didn't want the regime. Did they want to be bombed from the air? Did they want to see the entire? Did they want to see Tehran carpet bombed? Did they want to see hospitals and schools and infrastructure blown to smithereens? Did they want to see a war launched by Netanyahu? Which I think let's ask ourselves questions about some of the media coverage on this, which has been so horrific. I mean, looking at some of the stuff from the BBC, constantly platforming pro-Shah activists, as if the Shah and his son, the Shah who had been, again, remind ourselves of basic history here, the Shah who had been installed by the CIA and MI6, who then unleashed a reign of terror, that precipitated, that paved the way for an Islamist revolution to come in and a hardline government to come in. It didn't happen out of the blue. It came in as a direct result of the folly of our intervention there. So we had put in this tyrant, who'd run a police state, and his son is now being proposed as the future leader of Iran, a guy who has absolutely no constituency in Iran. You got people dancing in the streets here while their countrymen in Iran are being bombed and killed to smithereens. I mean, it's just a bit weird. And the BBC is kind of filming this stuff and saying, look at the Iranians who love what Trump is doing, and that's kind of the subtext. That they love, they're all excited and celebrating in the streets. Of course, there were some people who were celebrating, and that doesn't even necessarily mean that they were celebrating the bombing or anything like that. Of course, there were people in Iran who were celebrating the idea that the regime will fall. Absolutely. But that's not the whole story here. There are people who are being bombed. There are people who are scared. There are people who do not want this, and certainly people who are not saying, "Yes, we want Israel and Trump to kind of come in and just carpet bomb." So I think we need to kind of really lift the quality of the conversation here. The public discourse on this is really, people are not informed about the nuances and complexities of what's going on. And I think when we look at that and we look at what is being discussed without due process, without democratic oversight, the way in which this war is being conducted, the way in which they're planning to instrumentalize, groups that have been disenfranchised for decades, like the Kurds, who've faced this is the fifth or sixth time now that the Kurds have been told they're going to be, work with us and we will kind of give you some self-determination, and it's never ever happened. And now again, they're kind of being carrot and sticked into playing part of a wider kind of scheme, which no one really knows what is going on, what the end outcome is.
Nafeez, it's been great to speak to. Hopefully doing our bit to elevate that conversation around this awful conflict at the moment. Thank you so much for your time. That's Nafeez Ahmed, who is Head of Investigations at the Byline Times. And you can read Nafeez is done an excellent article about this and many other aspects of the war available at bylinetimes.com. That's our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's also where you should head if you want to take out a subscription to the Byline Times, which is a brilliant monthly newspaper which contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. So do head over there, as I say, to bylinetimes.com and spread the word about Byline Times and this podcast. Subscribe if you can. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.